Hello everyone, this is Professor Hasselman, History 104 online. Today we're going to be talking about Confederation, but in a sense I'm going to be talking about something larger than that, and by the end of the lecture I'll be talking about the Articles of Confederation. So today I'm going to discuss a different big question left over after all the fighting, and actually going on even during the fighting. And that is the question of what would happen to American governance now that the Declaration of Independence had been signed and independence had been gained from Great Britain. Now, I asked this question, what is government? And this is going to be the discussion for the next couple of weeks as well. So I want you to think about this while we're going through this lecture and then the next lecture when we deal with the Constitution, to kind of get an idea of what exactly were our founding fathers probably thinking of when they were forming a government. Now, a couple questions that the founding fathers and a lot of the Americans had was, this question about what would happen to American governance and how would independence from Great Britain actually affect the way that the states individually functioned and the way that they were governed together. And it's not just a question of little political technicalities, because as people at the time really knew, aside from the obvious tasks of winning the war and gaining independence, it was really political change. It was the shaping of new states, or new state governments, and the creation of some kind of a new national or American government that would shape the real outcome of the revolution as a whole. And as Jefferson put it, Thomas Jefferson, in the middle of the revolution, he said, "In truth, as it says here, a new government is the whole object of the present controversy." He says it's the whole object of the present controversy, for should a bad government be instituted for us in the future, it had been as well to have accepted at first the bad one offered to us from beyond the water, without the risk and expense of contest. So basically, as people at the time well knew, it was in the creation of governments in the states, and one for all the states, that the revolution ultimately would be lost or won. And we're going to hear people talking about the 1780s when they're a little alarmed at what's happening in the 1780s. And they're going to repeat that sentiment. And on a really immediate level, Americans knew that if they wanted to win the war in a broader sense, they had to have effective governments. And obviously, also in the longer term, they needed effective governments to survive, to prosper, and to last more than 5 years. And it's fascinating when you look at the letters between these people in the first couple years under the Constitution, they're really not convinced it's going to last more than 5 years. So people understood government is the key. So when the colonies declared independence in 76, and these former colonies became states, they needed to create new state governments that would basically write out the royal government out of their form of governance. Each state now needed to come up with a new way to govern itself, or some decision about how they were going to govern themselves. So from roughly 1776 through to the 1780s, the individual states, as we'll see in a little bit, the Continental Congress, grappled with trying to figure out the best mode of establishing new governments according to prevailing hopes and ideals. And this whole period was really a remarkable period of political experimentation. As Benjamin Franklin said, he said, "We are, I think, in the right road of the spirit of improvement, for we are making experiments." So basically in this whole period, not just the revolution, but a little before and certainly after, fueled by the optimism of the revolution and by the whole spirit of the Enlightenment, this was an age of experiments in government. So what I'm going to be talking about in this lecture, in that spirit, are these experiments of government, people experimenting in government, basically. And I'm going to talk about these kinds of experiments on two levels. So first, I'll talk about the state governments, about state constitution making, and how people were trying to figure out what to do on a state level. And then I'll discuss the process of joining all the states together into some kind of a confederation, or as the Articles of Confederation themselves put it, a league of friendship. And that's how the government defined itself, the Articles, as a league of friendship. But I want to start with state constitutions. And the fact is, although to us we think Constitution is sort of a big looming thing that's important in that period, to people at the time, certainly in the middle of the Revolution, it was really in the drafting of state constitutions that they really thought the future of the American people was going to be decided. Even before the formal Declaration of Independence in 1776, already people in the colonies had been giving some thought to the fact that they were going to need new state constitutions because already things were unstable. Royal sources of authority were not necessarily in place, but it was unclear what was in place instead of them. So people already saw the need for some kind of a new legitimate source of authority, and they began to think, okay, well, if we do end up being independent, we need some kind of a new government. So we'd better start talking about it now, because sooner or later, probably sooner, we're going to actually have to implement something. So as early as the beginning of 1776, states began considering what they should do about the unsettled state of governments in their own colonies. And some colonies actually wrote to the Continental Congress asking for some advice on what they should do about governance in their colonies. In May of 76, the Continental Congress adopted a resolution saying that colonial assemblies should adopt new governments. And just as the conservatives in Congress argued that resolution was what really was the instrument of American independence, conservatives saw that resolution as a really key turning point when the Continental Congress said to the colonies becoming states, I think it's time that you should devise your own constitutions. Now, it's important to note the Continental Congress wasn't in the lead here. What happened is that colonies were asking them what to do, and Congress sort of responded and figured out what it thought and then made a recommendation. So states were thinking about government before the Continental Congress necessarily did anything about it. Now, the first new constitution that had already been drafted in New Hampshire in January of 1776, making it the first written constitution drawn up by one of the colonies without consultation with or approval of the Crown or Parliament. So the states are all occupied with constitution making, and that continued through 1777. Now, at first, people in the Congress were undecided about whether maybe it would be smart to recommend to all the colonies one model constitution, but after a brief debate, the idea went nowhere, and that's basically for two reasons. I think one of them is really obvious, which is what is the likelihood that everybody in that Congress was going to agree on, well, what is the likelihood of everyone in that Congress is going to agree on a model constitution ought to look like in the states? I mean, probably not going to happen very easily. And on a purely pragmatic level, that'd be very hard to do. But second, and more important than that, the Congress ultimately felt that people in each colony or each state should really be adopting and devising their own governments that really suited their own character, their own habits, their own specific needs, local conditions. So really, it was the colonies themselves who were best suited. And it wasn't a smart idea to the Congress ultimately for them to be imposing a model anything, since part of the purpose of the Revolution was for people to devise governments that suited them better. And in making the suggestion that each colony should be free to create a constitution that reflected their particular values or habits, the Congress was pretty much acting in accordance with the prevailing belief at the time that there was, or certainly that there should be, an intimate connection between the values of a people, between the habits of a people on the one hand, and their instruments of government and systems of law on the other. And it's a general assumption at the time, and one shapes the other. One should shape the other, as they would think in the colonies, and that's part of the assumption that the Continental Congress is acting on. But just because Congress didn't design a model, it doesn't mean that individual continental congressmen didn't begin thinking about what ought to be happening in their own states back home. And in fact, so many continental congressmen became so obsessed with the idea of state constitution making for their own states that some people feared that some of the basic demands of the Revolution were falling by the wayside. Now, one result of this obsession with constitution making was this pamphlet by John Adams titled Thoughts on Government. And now Adams had long been really interested in constitutional issues, and he actually had something of a reputation for being someone who was pretty knowledgeable on the subject. So when these states began talking about new constitutions, beginning at the very end of 75, going through 76, several men from different states came to ask him for his advice. So by April of 76, Adams had turned his ideas into this pamphlet. Now, besides the obvious practical use of the pamphlet, and I'm going to come back to some of the things he recommends in a minute, Adams also intended it to be a response to the concluding section of Thomas Paine's Common Sense, published a few months earlier. So, Adams basically thought that common sense was irresponsible and impractical, and it was giving ideas about forming a new government that didn't make sense. Paine had said that there should be a unicameral, a one-house legislature for each of the colonies, and all of those would be subordinate to a unicameral legislature like the Continental Congress. No level of government would have an independent executive. So basically, Adams is thinking about it. Paine is just tossing off separation of powers and the balance of powers and saying, we don't need to think about that. We should be thinking about the people. We should be thinking about making a government responsive to the people, which is a nice idea, but Adams thought in reality there's no way that that's going to work. Adams, on the other hand, though he valued what Paine had to say obviously about independence, did not appreciate the whole plan. And in Thoughts on Government, Adams argued that whatever the states did with these new governments, they should at least preserve the best of Anglo-American traditions of government, and particularly separation of powers. Adams did not like the idea of having a one-house assembly and having no executive at all. He argued that there was no way that could work well. A one-house legislature would never be effective. It could never do anything executive, and it could never do anything judicial. And as he put it, a one-house legislature could not act as an executive power, quote, for want of two essential properties, secrecy and dispatch. That's what executives need to be. No Congress will ever manage those two things, being able to keep things secret and then dispatch of the things that they come up with. He also said that a one-house legislature couldn't be a judicial power because it was, as he said, quote, too numerous, too slow, and too little skilled in the laws, unquote. And just as bad as to Adams, a unicameral legislature was just unstable in and of itself. And as he put it, it was, as he said, liable to all the vices, follies, and frailties of an individual, subject to fits of humor, starts of passion, flights of enthusiasm, partialities or prejudice, and consequently productive of hasty results and absurd judgments, as he said. He really preferred a bicameral legislature, both houses of which would elect a governor. The governor would have a veto over legislation. He could appoint judges and some other officers with the consent of the upper house. Judges would have tenure for life during good behavior, and all officials apart from judges would be elected annually to prevent an aristocratic ruling class from rising up and keep politicians humble because they'd have to go home every year and get reelected. And to Adams, that would successfully keep politicians humble. A rotation in office would be something that would keep the right spirit of government going, according to Adams. So, all this talking about new governments, the fact is, as I suggested, when Adams says we should be preserving the best features of Anglo-American governance, these state constitutions generally did preserve some basic features of Anglo-American governance. So take, for example, a bicameral legislature, obviously resembling Parliament's House of Commons and House of Lords. Obviously, America did not have lords and commons in quite the same way, but the idea remained you had two houses and you had different sets of people in the two, although it was not entirely clear what that meant in the American example, and this was actually a source of confusion. Now, when the Constitution first starts with this new bicameral legislature, people aren't sure if the Senate is kind of like a House of Lords, meaning that the people in the Senate were sort of higher up than the representatives. Should they have special privileges? Should they get a higher salary? Are they special people in comparison to the House? Should we really be making that kind of difference between the House and the Senate? And you can see this throughout this period in somewhat ridiculous ways. People were so focused on it. Now, a second traditional assumption that was represented in the new state constitutions concerned the need for property requirements for voting and for holding elected office. And the reasoning there being men who owned property were independent men, so they could vote for themselves as they thought rather than being dependent on someone else, and thus maybe having to vote in a way that somebody else wanted them to vote. And likewise, it was thought that if you had literally financial investment in a community, you were the people best qualified to affect that community through elections. So though the revolution would inspire many states to reduce the level of the property requirement for voting, the fact is that those kinds of restrictions remained in place. And on average, in the new state constitutions, roughly, there was an increase of about 15% in the number of adult white males voting. So that was held onto as well as something that people felt comfortable with. It was a precedent and a tradition that made sense to them. Now, there were other ways in which these constitutions reflected the immediate impact of the revolution, and the first and most obvious example of that is the simple fact that they're writing constitutions. Americans were revealing their recognition of what they revealed to be the instability and lack of security in unwritten constitutions. And as they looked at Great Britain, they thought, we don't like that system very much. We want everything in writing. We want it all on paper. Americans wanted to fix the principles of the new governments in writing in a form that was distinct from and superior to mere legal statutes. Now, you can also see the immediate impact of the revolution in the three main ideas that were at the core of the most of these state constitutions, three sort of basic ideas. So number one, most of these constitutions were premised on the idea that they had to be grounded on natural rights. And you can really see this belief reflected in the declarations of rights that were amended to most state constitutions. And again, there's a lot that's traditional in these declaration of rights, because a lot of the rights that are being declared in these declarations are traditional English rights, but they're being put on paper in these documents and then attached to these sort of constitutional statements, creating whatever these new states were going to be. Now, most of these declarations of rights specified things like the right of trial by jury. They thought back to the revolution, and they remembered those vice admiralty courts not popular, so they want to right by trial by jury. The right not to be deprived of life, liberty, and property through the protection of due process of law, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and in some states like Virginia, freedom of religion. Rights that are familiar to us, rights that they're putting down on paper and attaching to constitutions at this moment in time. So declarations of rights were shared by constitutions, and this sort of idea that there are these natural rights that need to be written down and memorialized, one of the things that all of these states' constitutions generally share. Now, the other two main ideas that were at the core of these constitutions are related. Most constitutions declared that representation is based on consent, again, obviously coming right out of the revolution. Consent is important in the process of representation. And the third and last basic idea related to that is, and maybe it's the most central one of all, sovereignty rests with the people. The people are sovereign. And as the Virginia Constitution declared, and a lot of the other states in one way or another rephrased it, all power is vested in and consequently derived from the people. That the magistrates are their trustees and servants, and at all times amenable to them. Now, what does that exactly mean? And how is it going to actually boil down into what people are actually doing? And how beholden should the government be to the people? Kind of bring us back to that question from the beginning of what is government and what's its responsibility. And this varied in different states depending on a number of different kinds of factors. One dramatic way in which you could really see the sovereignty of the people being emphasized in these new states is through the way in which they curbed executive power. They curbed the power of state governors. They made state governors less important, and they usually made the lower house of their legislators more important as well. They often made the upper house of legislators less important. They're really trying to limit power and to curb power. And again, that's obviously really connected to what they had just experienced in the revolution, which felt to them like this sort of monarchical unlimited power that they had no control over. So as I said, almost every new constitution increased the power of the lower house and decreased the power of the governor and decreased the power of the upper house of their legislatures. And as we'll see in a moment, the national government that ends up being created under the Articles follows the same general pattern. They just eliminate executive, and they don't have a judicial branch either. So basically, everyone's really scared of, of executive power, of centralized power at this point. So summing up what I've just been discussing, in essence, most new state constitutions shared a few basic institutional features. They had a bicameral legislature, they had a weak executive, they had a rotation in office, and as far as principles go, a lot of them at least had Declaration of Rights, the idea that representation should be based on consent, and that the government rests on the people, that the people are sovereign, and somewhat broader electorate voting in annual elections. Now, one last point I want to discuss about state constitutions before we get into the Articles. While all the state constitution revision was taking place, there were actually two states that were not taking part in it. Not out of protest, but because their colonial charters actually had, in a sense, been more radical than the others. To begin with, and of course, they are Connecticut and Rhode Island. Now, their colonial charters had basically made them self-governing already on a certain level. So they didn't have to do dramatic changes to make them into state constitutions. So they basically preserved their colonial charters as constitutions and didn't really change them until the 19th century. Now, so that gets us up to the world, through the world of state constitutions and in the world of creating some kind of government. Now, for the new union under the new Union of American States, that ends up being the Articles of Confederation. Now, on July 12, 1776, just after they had declared independence, the Continental Congress also was trying to create some kind of a proposal for a new national government. And between 1776 and 1777, the Continental Congress drafted the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles are a document that literally created the United States of America. They literally gave the name to the United States of America, but it's not important. But it's important to note that they actually meant that really literally. We sort of don't think of what that phrase means, but it was really literally. And in context of what I'm talking about, what that said was this was not one consolidated nation. This was United States. What the Articles created, it united some states together. And that's what that phrase literally meant. As John Adams explained it, as he explained it later, they never thought of consolidating this vast continent under one national government, but instead erected a confederacy of states, each of which must have a separate government. So when 13 free and independent states had defeated England and now had to figure out how to come together, they were not thinking of one big unified republic at this point. They really definitely were not. And the Articles of Confederation went along with that thinking. It did not create one unified government. It did not bond people together in anything other than a loose league. The Articles created a loose league of individual republican governments. Now, if, as the founding generation assumed, absolute power corrupts absolutely, then the Articles was a very virtuous form of government, because under the Articles, the Confederation Congress had almost no power to enforce its will at all. Now, the newly created Confederation was almost more of a United Nations than a central governing institutions, as the article themselves stated. They were intended to create, quote, a firm league of friendship for their common defense, the security of their liberties, and their mutual and general welfare. The Articles were basically a pact between 13 sovereign states, which agreed that certain powers would be delegated to this new central government for specific purposes, but these 13 sovereign states retained all power not expressly delegated by them in the Articles. So under the Articles, the national government consisted of a one-chamber national Congress elected by state legislators. Each state had one vote, Congress could not request funds from the states, but it could request funds, from the states, but it could not enact a tax on its own without every state's approval. So it could not really make its own taxes. It could not regulate interstate commerce between the states. The Articles did not provide for any kind of executive branch or any kind of an executive character at all. Instead, congressional committees oversaw anything having to do with finance or diplomacy or military affairs. There was no judicial system by which this new government could compel allegiance to its laws. So basically, as far as the powers of Congress were concerned, the Confederation Congress was kind of filling the place of the imperial system. It could regulate foreign affairs, it could declare war with foreign countries, it could negotiate peace treaties, it could fix standards for weights and measures, it could manage Indian affairs, it could borrow money, although it couldn't really tax, and basically the Confederation Congress had power over war and foreign affairs, and the states maintained control over what they called internal policing. Now, it's important to realize that in the context of the time when they were created, the Articles actually made perfect sense. I think it's really easy to look at the Articles and say, what were they thinking? How did they make sense? Well, let's create a government and give it no power. So I think the Articles get a bum rap, basically, in the long view of history. And I think it's important to realize at that moment in time that they made perfect sense, given the experience of the Revolution and what people had just experienced in the realm of government. And of course, your Schweikart book, The Patriots' History of the United States, clearly lays out the same argument, that we really have ignored the Articles of Confederation, and instead we look at the Constitution as the birth of the nation. Now, basically the Articles denied to this new government the very powers and violations that it had seen at the heart of the Revolution. So the Congress can't tax, the Congress can't overrule local laws, the Congress can't alter a state constitution, it can't interfere with state judicial proceedings, and again, when people are creating constitutions, they learn a lesson, and then they act based on that lesson that they learned. You can actually see people experiencing something, thinking about what that means, and then creating a government based on those immediate lessons. That's what we see here with the Articles. And then to avoid an entrenched elite, the Articles did establish a rotation in office. So you could not be in office more than 3 or every 6 years. You couldn't be president of Congress more than one in any 3 years. And any delegate could be instantly recalled by his home state. So there we see this weak central government, lots of things it can't do. Now, there were very, very few things that the states were restricted from doing under this new compact, but there were a couple of things that states were not supposed to do. So no state could enter into an alliance or treaty with a foreign nation without the consent of Congress. So New Jersey cannot make a treaty with France. They need to go through Congress. No 2 or more states could enter into a confederation with the consent of Congress. So New England can't break away and form its own confederation without at least checking with us first. It's saying states are not supposed to form their own little mini confederations. States were not to keep warships or troops in peacetime unless Congress deemed it necessary for defense. States were also not supposed to declare war without consent of Congress, except where sudden invasion admitted of no delay. For example, if pirates attacked, states could declare war. So essentially the Articles of Confederation were designed so that the new nation's central government would not infringe on the states. And as I said before, it would kind of fill the hole where the British imperial system had been before. Have a very, very limited sphere of actions, not really have a power of enforcement, and leave everything that wasn't specified to the states to control on their own. So we had this revolution, and the states and the colonies, they come together, they unite, they fight together, and then the war ends. So guess what the 1780s is going to look like? It's going to look just like it had, what you might think it looked like. The states basically all turn their back on each other and say, well, That was nice. Now we're going to do our own things. Thank you very much, everyone. So the Articles is drafted in a time when there is this cooperation going on between the states. So this ends my discussion and lecture on the Confederation. And in our next lecture, we're going to be discussing a couple things about the creation of the Constitution, whether or not it was actually a democratic creation. And we're also going to be talking about in other lectures about the Enlightenment and the thinking of our forefathers, and whether or not what they were thinking was their own ideas or were borrowed from someone else.